Welcome, bienvenidos, benvindu, to the Soccermetrics Copa Libertadores show, part of the SDH network, the only English language show devoted to South America's premier club competition. I'm your host, Howard Hamilton, the founder of Soccermetrics. In April of 2024, I started this podcast with the idea of presenting news, comment, and stories surrounding CONMEBOL's Copa Libertadores. Last month, I marked my 100th episode, but I wasn't able to mark the occasion properly until now. So I'm taking advantage of this off week in the Libertadores to look back at past episodes, look ahead to what's to come, and tell the story of one of the last great super teams of South American football, the Sao Paulo FC teams of the 1990s. But first, we start with news from around the Libertadores. And we start with the confirmation that this season's Libertadores final will be at the Estadio Centenario in Montevideo, Uruguay. On May 9, CONMEBOL President Alejandro Dominguez confirmed on social media the location of the final, and he mentioned that advanced teams were visiting the stadium to move forward preparations for the final. Now, the Estadio Centenario was supposed to be closed in 2026 for renovations ahead of the 2030 World Cup. There's supposed to be a match celebrating the centenary of the World Cup at Estadio Centenario. But those renovation plans have been moved back because of continued discussion over the construction, over the specific plans for renovation, and plans for financing. The Uruguayan government doesn't want to foot the bill for renovations to the stadium. Financing is going to come through mostly private sources, and a Chinese consortium has been lined up to take the lead on the renovation project. At any rate, renovation won't start until 2027. The Estadio Centenario has hosted 21 Libertadores finals in its history. One final in the neutral site era, the 2021 final between Palmeiras and Flamengo. News item 2 involves investigations opened by CONMEBOL. Now, we all know about the events surrounding last week's match between Independiente Medellin and Flamengo. CONMEBOL issued a provisional sanction to deem 60 days without their own fans home and away. That means matches that are at home will be conducted behind closed doors, and no traveling fans will be permitted for any of Independiente Medellin's away matches in South American competitions. Now, Independiente Medellin don't have any remaining home matches in the group stage. They have 2 away matches, though. Both club representatives will appear at a disciplinary hearing in Asunción on the 19th of May. Flamengo have asked for the match to be ruled as a win, usually an administrative 3-0 result to the other side. There will almost certainly be monetary penalties applied to Independiente Medellin, and we're going to have to wait to see what the specifics of the punishment will be. In addition, CONMEBOL have opened investigations involving events surrounding Cruzeiro versus Boca Juniors, involving discriminatory gestures by fans of both teams, ripping up currency notes, monkey gestures, and other unsavory things that happened. Also, Universitario versus Nacional. Universitario were charged with not following organizational rules of the Libertadores event. And Sporting Cristal versus Junior. Sporting Cristal were charged with not following post-match press conference rules. The third news item involves a new manager at Universitario de Deportes. And that new manager is Héctor Cooper. Cooper, who is from Argentina, he's 70 years old, has a long history coaching in club and international football. In club football, he started his career at Huracan and Lanús. He later moved on to Spain to coach Mallorca and Valencia, and he had a stint at Inter Milan. His lone, his lone trophy was a Copa Conmebol at Lanús in 1996. Probably his greatest accomplishment as a manager was leading Valencia to 2 consecutive Champions League finals in 2000 and 2001. Since then, he has coached international football for the last 10 years, in particular leading Egypt to the 2018 World Cup. Universitario is Cooper's first club job in 12 years, and he's back in South America after 30. Interestingly enough, he's not the oldest manager in the competition. Jorge Fossati is 73 years old. In the press conference in which Cooper was introduced to the media, he said, quote, "I'm going to have to adapt to the squad, but the squad has to adapt to me as well." He arrives at Universitario at an interesting time, with the change in management and also with a real chance of advancing to the latter stages of Libertadores in their last 2 matches. So those were the news from around the Libertadores, and that's the end of part 1. In part 2, the story of Sao Paulo FC. Part 2 of the Soccermetrics Copa Libertadores show, part of the SDH network. And now let's get into this historical vignette, the golden era of Sao Paulo Football Club in the 1990s. Sao Paulo FC are one of the major teams of Brazilian football. They have a great history, but all but 2 of SPFC's continental successes occurred in the 1990s. I'm going to tell you the story of how that came to be and how dominant they were. Sao Paulo Football Club were founded in 1930 by former members of 2 sports clubs that had abandoned football. They adopted the famous red and black stripes, the Paulista tricolor. Now, there were some fits and starts after the club was founded, and the football division didn't start up until 1935. Sao Paulo were successful in Sao Paulo state tournaments. They were more successful in the state tournaments than in national tournaments. And this was an era when state tournaments in Brazil had a higher priority than national competitions. In fact, the national competition didn't start in Brazil until 1971. Sao Paulo would dominate state football in the 1940s, winning 5 championships, and in the 1980s, winning 5 championships during that decade. And they won 2 Brazilian championships, one in 1977 and another in 1986. They supplied players to the Brazilian national team on a regular basis. In fact, every Brazilian World Cup winning squad had at least one Sao Paulo player on it. Only Palmeiras matched that achievement. But by 1990, there was really a desire for a change. They had missed out on the championship phase of the Paulista tournament. They fired their manager, and people were expecting Sao Paulo to decline. But they turned to one manager who turned out to be absolutely fundamental to not only their recovery, but to the launch of their golden era. And that man was Tele Santana. Tele Santana was born in 1931. He had a professional career as a center forward for Fluminense. With over 500 appearances and 165 goals, he still ranks 3rd in the club in most appearances and 5th in most goals. Santana started his coaching career in 1971, winning a national title at Atlético Mineiro, the inaugural year of the Brazilian Championship in 1971, and he won state titles at Fluminense, Atlético, and Grêmio. In addition, he had a spell in the 1980s with Saudi Arabian club Al Ahly that was also successful. But it was with the Brazilian national team that Santana built his reputation, coaching the national team in the 1982 and 1986 World Cups. The 1982 team is legendary. It is considered one of the best teams not to win it. His team stood out for, the quality of their play, their technical skill. They're always on the attack. The best defense was a superior offense. Perhaps if he had applied more defensive solidity, they would have gotten past Italy and perhaps hoisted that fourth World Cup title a lot sooner. But that was not to be the case. That World Cup really affected Santana's reputation in Brazil. Like seen as a romantic, but doing everything except achieving the thing that was most important, which was winning a World Cup. So when he arrived at Sao Paulo in 1990, on October 13, 1990, he was 59 years old and he had a point to prove. As I mentioned, Santana was described as the last romantic of Brazilian football. His philosophy was based on three pillars. One, always be on the attack. Two, work frequently on fundamentals in training. He was famous for having drills on ball passing and set pieces in his training sessions. And three, a firm commitment to fair play. Santana spoke out very openly against violent conduct and violent play in Brazilian football and football in general. But he was a critic of just how overly physical the game was starting to become in the 1990s. You could see Tele Santana as expressing the Brazilian equivalent of total football. And it was no accident he was an admirer of the Netherlands sides in the 1970s. Now, total football is the principle of deploying your players in basically any position on the field and having them function just as well as their natural position. He built this Sao Paulo side around a base of core players such as Zeti, who was a goalkeeper for him, who would actually turn out to be the backup goalkeeper to Taffarel in the 1994 World Cup. Leonardo, a versatile left back who was highly technical. Cafu, a young Cafu, who was a right back, energetic and skilled. He would later become a captain of the Brazilian national team and raise the trophy in 2002. Ronaldinho, a center back who would go on to make over 300 appearances for the team. Paulinho, who would be the top scorer in the 1993 Copa Libertadores. Müller, forward who is very swift, very clever. And his midfield stars. Toninho Cerezo, who stood out for the team in 1992 and 1993. But the man who really made this team go was Rai. Rai was Socrates' brother. Socrates was a legendary midfielder for the Brazilian national team in the 1982 and 1986 World Cups. He was a playmaker, Rai was, and he was the captain of the squad. He joined the team in 1989, and he had a really positive first season with the squad, but he fell out with the fans. He was on the border of leaving the team, but he was rescued by Tele Santana. He was talked into returning to the team and redoubling his efforts. And I'm sure that Santana promised him that if he joined the team, that he would build a team around him that would dominate Brazilian football. And how right he was, and how fortunate for him and for Sao Paulo and for all who love South American football that Rai stayed. In 1990, Santana had a decent start. He finished second in the Brazilian Championship. This is at a time when the state championship dominated the year. It went on from about January through the middle part of the year, the later part of the year. The Brazilian Championship took up the second part of the year. And Sao Paulo came in second, losing to Corinthians in the final. In 1991 was when the golden era of Sao Paulo truly began. In the Paulista competition, Sao Paulo were in the repechage group because of their 1990 performance. It was a performance where opposing fans would deride them for being quote unquote relegated to a second division, but that was not in fact the case. There was no relegation in Brazilian football at the time, in the top division of Brazilian football, and they were sent down to another group. There was kind of a second tier within the first division of teams who were kind of mid-table, and they were combined with teams from lower divisions, to be sure, but it wasn't a true relegation. But yet, Sao Paulo were in that group because of their relatively lackluster performance in 1990. They finished first in that repechage group and advanced to the second group stage. In the second group stage, they finished top of the group, tied with Palmeiras, but they had the tiebreaker based on a better overall record, which to this day remains controversial in Brazilian football. And they advanced to the final versus Corinthians in a rematch of the 1990 Paulista final. Corinthians were a really strong side against Sao Paulo. They had dominated the previous 10 meetings, and Sao Paulo were only able to win just one time in the previous 10 meetings going back to 1987. This series would be very different. Both matches were conducted at Estadio Morumbi. Both teams shared that ground at the time. Sao Paulo would win the first leg 3-0 by a hat-trick by Rai, and they would win the title after a 0-0 draw. In the Brasileirão, Sao Paulo became stronger as the first phase went on. They sailed into first place late in that phase, and they finished with the best record. That allowed them to advance to the semifinal round, where they advanced past Atlético Mineiro based on a superior league record. In the final, they faced Bragantino, and they defeated Bragantino with 1 goal over the 2 legs. It was a third Brazilian title for Sao Paulo, and it would be the only one that Sao Paulo would win under Tele Santana. That Brasileirão championship allowed Sao Paulo to participate in Copa Libertadores in 1992. Tele Santana considered Copa Libertadores to be an unfair competition against Brazilian squads. And he was not the only one in Brazilian football to believe this. Brazilian teams actually withdrew from Copa Libertadores in the late 1960s because they believed that the competition was stacked against them in favor of Argentine and Uruguayan squads. In fact, Santana fielded a reserve squad in their first match of the competition against Criciúma, and they lost 3-0. The club directors insisted that Santana take the competition more seriously, and they mentioned that the competition would start to have anti-doping tests, which was something that Santana was a huge proponent of. So he changed his attitude to the competition, he took it more seriously, and Sao Paulo would finish second in the group. And this is a group that contained Criciúma, San Jose of Bolivia, and Club Bolivar. In the round of 16, they got past Nacional 3-0, winning both legs. They faced Criciúma again in the quarterfinals. This was a really tough match for them, but they overcame it through goals by Macedo and Paulinha to achieve a 2-1 aggregate victory. In the semifinal, they faced Barcelona of Guayaquil. They overwhelmed them 3-0 in the first leg. A Zeti error late in the second leg gave Barcelona a lifeline at 2-0. And they were pressing forward for an equalizing goal that would send the tie to penalties. But they weren't able to achieve that. And Sao Paulo would advance to their first Libertadores final in almost 2 decades, facing Newell's Old Boys. This would be a classic managerial face-off between Marcelo Bielsa and Tele Santana. In the first leg, Sao Paulo went down 1-0. In the second leg in Morumbi, before official attendance of 72,000, but an unofficial attendance of 105,000, with a further 20,000 fans stuck outside the gates, unable to get in, Sao Paulo achieves a 1-0 victory. This Copa Libertadores would be decided on penalty kicks. In the first two rounds, Rai and Ivan converted for Sao Paulo, while Ronaldinho's attempt in the third round was saved by Newell's keeper Norberto Scoponi. Newell's, for their part, saw Barrizzo hit the post, while Julio Zamora and Juan Manuel Lop convert in the first three rounds. So it's 2-2 heading into the fourth round. In the fourth round, Alfredo Mendoza missed his penalty, while Cafu converted for Sao Paulo to give them a 3-2 lead. In the fifth round of the penalty kick shootout, Fernando Gamboa's attempt was blocked away by Seti, and Sao Paulo would win 3-2 on penalties, becoming champions of America for the very first time. That Libertadores final, produced a hangover that persisted in the Brazilian Championships and the Paulista tournament. And in the Brazilian Championship, they finished sixth in the first stage, and they came in third in the second group stage with a 2-2-2 record. In the Paulista competition, Sao Paulo took off. They actually took off in August and September to play summer tournaments in Europe. And they were playing two prestigious competitions, the Teresa Herrera Trophy in La Coruña and the Ramon de Carranza Trophy in Madrid. These are two preseason tournaments in Europe where clubs from around the world are invited to play Spanish sides, other European sides. And in the Teresa Herrera Trophy, Sao Paulo defeated Barcelona 4-1. And this was a match in which Santana said afterward, quote, "We played the true Brazilian football tonight." They would go on to face Real Madrid in the Ramon de Carranza Trophy, and they would defeat them 4-0. So Sao Paulo despite the fact that these were summer tournaments, supposedly preseason tournaments, this was during an era where modern football really wasn't fully globalized. So people in Europe were finding out about Sao Paulo, or about this Sao Paulo team, for the first time. So defeating Barcelona and Real Madrid by lopsided scorelines really put them on notice. They would return to Sao Paulo State and finish first in the first phase of their group. And they would go on to finish first in their group in the second phase with 5 wins and a draw. The resulting final versus Palmeiras were played on both sides of the Intercontinental Cup. In their first leg, before they took off for Tokyo, they defeated Palmeiras by 4-2 in a magnificent display of attacking football. Rai scored a hat-trick, a sensational long-range effort, a penalty kick, and a header off a corner. Cafu scored a goal as well, which was another magnificent long-range effort. He provided an assist to one of those Rai goals, and he won a penalty that Rai eventually converted. Now, let's talk about the Intercontinental Cup versus FC Barcelona, because that occurred in between the final of the Paulista Championship. Sao Paulo would play FC Barcelona, who had just won the European Cup for the first time. This was one of the first really, really great Barcelona squads under Johan Cruyff. Hristo Stoichkov opened the scoring for Barcelona in the 12th minute, and Rai took over from there. He would level the scoreline in the 27th minute, Mueller assisting him beautifully for the equalizer. And 12 minutes from time, he would hit a free kick goal into the top shelf of the net. A magnificent effort that would give Sao Paulo the 2-1 win and award Rai man of the match honors. Johan Cruyff was full of praise for Sao Paulo after this match. He said, quote, "If you're going to be run over by a car, better it be by Ferrari." So the final judgment on the 1992 season, Sao Paulo played 84 matches, winning 45 of them and drawing 21, scoring 133 goals in the process. Rai led the team with 31 goals, followed by Paulinha on 25, Mueller with 24 goals. Rai was named South American Footballer of the Year, and Tele Santana was named Coach of the Year. Sao Paulo had the world at their feet. And the local and international media acknowledged Sao Paulo's superiority this season. The O Estado de Sao Paulo newspaper stated, "Sao Paulo FC is an example of sporting competence," end quote. And the Brazilian sports daily Placar stated, "Sao Paulo are today well out in front of their competitors." Now, as great as the 1992 season would be for Sao Paulo FC, 1993 would be an even better year. And this would produce a rare accomplishment in South American football, the international quadruple year. Sao Paulo had de-emphasized the local tournaments by this point. They had lost twice in the second group stage, and they finished second behind Corinthians, so they weren't able to get to the Paulista final. And this was a tournament that probably had the best quality of teams in the history of that competition. Corinthians had a great team, Palmeiras had a great team as well. In the Brazilian Championship, they finished behind that Palmeiras squad in the second group phase, also not able to get to the final. In the Copa Libertadores, they entered the competition in the round of 16, which was their right as current holders. They got past Newell's 4-2 on aggregate in a rematch in the 1992 final, going down 2-0 in Rosario before routing Newell's 4-0 at the Morumbi. In the quarterfinal, they defeated Flamengo 3-2 on aggregate, 1-1 away, 2-0 at home. And in the semifinal, they defeated Cerro Porteño by a single goal. A single goal at home provided the ultimate advantage. In the final, they would face Chile's Universidad Católica, who were also entering their golden era at this point in the 1990s. The first leg at the Morumbi is a match that would be long talked about in the history of this competition. An own goal by Dani Lopez gave Sao Paulo the initial 1-0 lead, before goals by Victor, Gilmar, Rai himself, and Mueller gave Sao Paulo a 5-0 advantage. Universidad Católica would pull a goal back late in this encounter, and they would take a 2-0 lead in the second leg in Sao Paulo. But that 5-1 deficit in Sao Paulo was too much for the Chilean side to overcome. Sao Paulo FC ran out 5-3 aggregate winners, and they would become champions of America for the second time in as many seasons. These would be the last two matches for playmaker Rai, who would leave for Paris Saint-Germain at the conclusion of the competition. Sao Paulo picked up from where they left off. They defeated Gremio in the La Copa Sudamericana after a goalless draw over two legs, overcoming them on penalty kicks 4-2. And in the Supercopa Libertadores, a competition that combined all previous winners of the competition, of the Libertadores, They defeated Independiente, Gremio, and Atlético Nacional on the way to the final before overcoming Flamengo 5-3 on penalties after a 4-all draw. In the Intercontinental Cup, Sao Paulo would face AC Milan. This was an AC Milan side that were in the middle of a 58-match unbeaten streak. They had won the 92-93 Serie A competition with an unbeaten record, conceding just 25 goals in 54 matches. Now, despite the incoming record of two teams, this would be a back and forth encounter with a lot of goals scored. Paulinho opened the scoring for Sao Paulo before Daniele Massaro equalized for the Milan squad. Cerezo would give Sao Paulo a 2-1 lead on the hour before Jean-Pierre Papin equalized with 9 minutes to go. The winning goal was scored 2 minutes from time thanks to Müller, giving Sao Paulo a 3-2 win in Tokyo. They completed a back-to-back Libertadores and Intercontinental double. Only Santos achieved that 30 years before, and only Boca Juniors in 2000 and 2001 came close to matching that since. Over 98 matches played in 1993, Sao Paulo would win 46 of them while drawing 30, scoring 163 goals in the process. Rai, despite not playing for the squad in the second half of the year, finished as the leading scorer for Sao Paulo with 22 goals, shared with Paulinho. Cafu also contributed with 20 goals, which is sensational when you consider that Cafu is more of a defensive player, followed by Müller on 15 goals. 1994 would be the tail end of the golden era for Sao Paulo. They defeated Botafogo in the Recopa Sudamericana 3-1. This is a match that took place in Kobe, Japan. And they won the Copa Conmebol. This was a competition that introduced players such as Rogério Ceni, Juninho Paulista, and Denilson to the world. They defeated Gremio, Sporting Cristal, and Corinthians on the way to the final, in which they routed Peñarol 6-1. It was the most lopsided result in the history of South American club finals. And Sao Paulo re-entered the Copa Libertadores competition as holders, getting all the way to the final before falling on penalties to Vélez Sarsfield. In 1995, Santana resigned due to health reasons. Over 391 matches that he coached at Sao Paulo, he led the team to 2 state titles, 1 national title, and a staggering 8 international trophies. In 2006, Tele Santana passed away at the age of 74. He left a legacy in which he inspired managers such as Marcelo Bielsa, Arrigo Sacchi, and Pep Guardiola. Over his career, he wanted to prove that a team that took technique and beauty seriously was also capable of winning football matches and winning football trophies. And he did just those things at Sao Paulo Football Club. That concludes this historical vignette into Sao Paulo's golden era. In part 3, a look back at the first 100 episodes. Part 3 of the Soccermetrics Copa Libertadores show, part of the SDH network. And now let's talk about the first 100 episodes of this show, of this podcast. And it's hard to believe it's been 2 years since I sat down with Jason Longshore and proposed this project. This idea of talking about the Copa Libertadores. They talk about South American football on Soccer Over There. And I wanted to see if a dedicated show in English, talking about the Copa Libertadores could be successful. And, Jason, has always been supportive. He felt this would be something worth considering. And I got to work on it. And it has been a lot of work. but it has been very rewarding. And in the process, there are some episodes that I'm really proud of having produced over the first 100 episodes. And I'll talk about some of them here. And let's talk about the first episode. That was one in which I talked about the pre-Libertadores history and how the Libertadores competition came to be. I don't think many people outside of South America realize that international club competitions in South America have a long history and predate European club competitions. The competition in the 1940s, competition in the early 1910s, 1920s, they may have been between just Argentine and Uruguayan squads, but they were there. But also how the European Cup really influenced the formation of Copa Libertadores and vice versa. Copa Libertadores had a group stage in the 1960s, almost 3 decades before the European Champions League implemented the same thing. So that was a really great thing to talk about in that initial episode. The fifth episode discussed the history of Copa Intercontinental, how that came to be. Because of the European Champions Cup and the Copa Libertadores, there was talk almost immediately of having the two winners face off in the competition. The transition from a two-leg encounter between South America and Europe to a one-off final in Tokyo sponsored by Toyota. And there have been some memorable matches in that competition. Some great players, some great sides have been part of the Copa Intercontinental. FIFA has their own version of it now, but it's not quite the same as the European South American teams meeting up in Tokyo at the end of the year. Episode 9 discussed one of those teams that really became the first super team in South America, and that was the Santos side led by Pelé in the early 1960s. And it's really amazing to realize just how dominant that Santos FC side were in the early 1960s and how much the rest of the world held them in awe. Not just Europe, but also South America, Africa, other parts of the world. And of course, the legendary Pelé leading it all. Episode 23 was a really emotional episode to produce. And this was one in tribute to Juan Izquierdo, the leader of Nacional, one of the leading players of Nacional, I should say, who suffered a cardiac arrest in a Libertadores match against Sao Paulo, interestingly enough. He passed away 5 days after that event, and that was a really difficult episode to research and write. That's probably the only episode that has no intro and outro music. But I'm really proud of the work that I did in putting that episode together. Episode 53, talking about the history of Mexican clubs in Copa Libertadores. And what's interesting about Mexican clubs in this competition is that they really made an impact right away. Cruz Azul getting to a Copa Libertadores final in 2001. There were some really great sides who participated in that competition. This was perhaps the golden era of Liga MX. They had a lot of money. You had a lot of really great players from South America who were playing there. They were 100% competitive with the club sides from Argentina and Brazil. And they were seen as big money squads during much of that era. Unfortunately, that's not an era that is likely to come back. I mean, it could If MLS teams join Mexican squads, I think that's the only way that teams from North America will be able to enter the competition. But episode 53 presented an interesting look at a really interesting phase of the Copa Libertadores history. There was a preview of South American clubs at the Club World Cup last year. And I talked very extensively in that episode about the five teams that were representing CONMEBOL at that competition. I discussed their history, I discussed how they got to play in the Club World Cup, and the current squad at the time. I think the Club World Cup became interesting because of the presence of these South American squads. Flamengo had a great run. Palmeiras, of course, had a great run as well. Botafogo had a memorable victory against Paris Saint-Germain, which I said at the time was probably even more impressive than their Libertadores win at the end of 2024. That was a lot of work, but I really enjoyed putting that episode together. Another thing that I'm proud of has been providing more attention to the women's Libertadores competition. Now, club football in South America is not as developed as club football in Europe. Definitely not North America, but it is growing. Brazilian teams have a stranglehold in the competition. Corinthians has a stranglehold in the competition. They've won it 5 or 6 times now. But I'm really proud of giving attention to the women's side of the Copa Libertadores. And I gave previews and run-throughs of the competition in episodes 20 to 30 in the 2024 competition and episodes 73 to 75 of the 2005 competition. Probably one of the most thrilling things that I did was traveling down to Buenos Aires in 2024 to watch the Copa Libertadores final in person. And that was a memorable final between Botafogo and Atletico Mineiro. Really thrilling match for the neutral, which is not always common in continental club finals, especially Copa Libertadores. I still have my own feelings about a neutral site final as opposed to a 2-leg final, but it's so much better to watch the final as a neutral in a neutral site. So episode 37 rather, I talked about my finals watching experience in person. I still look at the pictures and videos that I recorded, during that match, during my week in Buenos Aires. The pictures of the Botafogo fans, the expression of emotion after that third and deciding goal was scored, is something that will live long in my memory. And I've posted it on my Twitter feed. I've posted it on my Instagram account. It's really a great final to watch live. The vignettes about the individuals, the players and coaches who made Copa Libertadores what it is today. Alberto Spencer, the all-time leading goal scorer in the competition. That was episode 28. Carlos Bianchi, episode 34. Mirko Josic, the first foreign manager to win Copa Libertadores in episode 68. And of course, the vignettes on, on the great teams, where Santos, Sao Paulo, Vélez, Vélez and Boca, which is incorporated into that look into Carlos Bianchi. So there are some really great episodes I'm really proud of producing. It's been a lot of work, as I've said. It's been a lot of trial and error. My plans for what's next is to really get more professional with the production, get more professional with recording, with editing practices. I would really like to incorporate more interviews with reporters or fans and analysts involved with the competition. it's really hard to incorporate numbers in an audio-only podcast, but I would like to do more of that. I do some of that. I incorporate some of my own analysis, as part of Soccermetrics. And I also like to flirt more with video. I'm a little shy about being on video, but video is where podcasts are going, or really have gone. And you really do need to have a strong video component. That requires some more work on my part, as far as having a backdrop and a set to make those things happen. But I'm really curious about, really incorporating video as part of this podcast, package. So that's my look back at the first 100 episodes of the Soccermetrics Copa Libertadores show. And this would not have happened without the people of soccer down here. I really can't thank them enough for the file production, for distributing this episode together. You can find episodes on YouTube and Facebook. They've been really good about that. In addition to Jason Longshore, I thank John Nelson, Scott Flood, all the other staff who make soccer down here happen. Nick, Jarrett, really great people to meet in person, really great people to know online. And really all of you for listening. Really appreciate the attention that you have given to this podcast, an expression of your interest in me, this interest in South American football. And I hope that I present this competition as well as I possibly can, because it's a really fascinating competition, within world football. And I'm glad that people have found out about it. And my goal is to introduce more people to it. And that's my goal in the next 100 episodes and beyond. So if you have a comment or question about this podcast or about the Libertadores, you're more than welcome to send it to my X handle at Soccermetrics. You could also send questions or comments to @SoccerDownHere or to Jason Longshore at Longshoe. As I mentioned, this show is distributed on YouTube and Facebook, and you can follow the conversations there. Next week, the Copa Libertadores will be back, and in the next episode, I'll preview match day 5 of the group stage. This has been the Soccermetrics Copa Libertadores show, proudly part of the SDH network. See you later. Hasta luego, e até mais.